The woman in my mirror is crying blood. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound had come from the bathroom, loud enough to shatter the silence of the night. For a second, I thought I was dreaming, but then the low hum of the house settling snapped me back to reality. Seriously, I muttered, swinging my legs off the bed. The clock on my nightstand blinked 3:13 a.m. Great, just what I needed. Some plumbing issue or another broken shelf. Grabbing my phone for light, I shuffled toward the bathroom. The hallway was dark, shadows stretching and shifting as I moved. My pulse was steady, annoyed more than anything else. But when I reached the bathroom door, something made me pause. The air was colder here, like the heater had stopped working entirely. A faint, metallic smell lingered, sharp and unnatural. Pushing the door open, I froze. Jagged lines splintered out from the center of the cracked mirror above the sink, resembling a spider web. Shards of glass littered the sink and floor, glittering in the weak light from my phone. My brain scrambled for answers. Had the mirror fallen? No, it was still mounted on the wall. Maybe an earthquake, but I hadn't felt anything. That's when I saw her. In the fractured reflection of the mirror, a woman's face stared back at me, pale skin stretched tight over hollow cheekbones, her eyes dark pits that seemed to pull me in. Tears of blood streaked down her face, dripping soundlessly into the sink. Her lips trembled as she mouthed something I couldn't hear. I stumbled back, my phone slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The light spun wildly, casting jagged shadows across the walls. No, 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 I whispered, my throat dry. The woman moved. At first, I thought it was just the glass, warping the image. But then her head tilted, slowly, deliberately. Her bloodshot eyes locked onto mine, and the corners of her mouth pulled back into a grotesque grin. My chest tightened, my breath catching as she reached a hand toward me. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. My scream caught in my throat as I whirled around, pressing my back against the wood. The mirror shook violently, the cracks spreading like veins across its surface. "Let me out!" I yelled, pounding on the door. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive air. When I looked back at the mirror, the woman was gone. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. The room fell silent, too silent. Even the faint hum of the pipes had stopped. My phone's light flickered on the floor, casting erratic patterns. That made my skin crawl. A sudden gust of cold air hit me, and I turned back to the mirror, just in time to see her step out. She didn't climb or crawl through the glass. She simply emerged, like stepping through a doorway. Her movements were slow, almost graceful, but there was something horribly wrong about the way her limbs twisted and bent as she walked. Her bare feet made no sound on the tile floor, but the blood from her eyes left crimson streaks in her wake. My entire body screamed at me to move, to do something, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the impossible sight. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head again, that same unnerving motion as before. Her lips parted, revealing teeth too sharp and too many. Then she spoke, her voice a raspy, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Why are You? Here? My stomach twisted. What do you mean? This is my house? Her grin widened, and she took another step forward. I pressed myself harder against the door, fumbling for the doorknob. It wouldn't budge, the wood cool and unyielding beneath my palm. The woman raised a hand, her fingers long and claw-like. She dragged them down the nearest wall, leaving deep, jagged marks. You shouldn't be here. I didn't wait to hear more. Desperation took over, and I dove for my phone. My hand closed around it just as she lunged. Her claws swiped the air where I'd been, missing me by inches. Scrambling on my hands and knees, I threw myself at the door, slamming my shoulder against it with everything I had. It groaned under the pressure, but didn't give. Behind me, I heard her laugh, a low wheezing sound that made my skin crawl. My fingers finally found the lock, twisting it violently. The door flew open, and I stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. My back hit the wall, and I slid to the floor, gasping for air. The sound of my heartbeat roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard her voice again. I'll see you. Soon. The lights flickered, and the metallic smell faded. When I finally mustered the courage to stand, I opened the door a crack. Peering inside, the bathroom was empty. The mirror was whole, not a single crack marring its surface. Even the glass shards on the floor were gone, as if nothing had happened, but the claw marks on the wall remained. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the blood tears, the jagged grin, the impossible way she had stepped out of the mirror, like it was nothing more than a doorway. The claw marks on the bathroom wall were still there, mocking me every time I passed by. By morning, I'd convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Stress, exhaustion, maybe a nightmare that felt too real. But even as I told myself that, the unease lingered. I avoided the bathroom entirely, brushing my teeth in the kitchen sink and splashing water on my face like a coward. It's nothing, I muttered to myself, staring at my reflection in the small, smudged window above the sink. You're fine. Get it together. Then the reflection moved. It was subtle at first, a flicker of motion that didn't match my own. I froze, staring at the glass. My reflection stared back, wide-eyed and pale, but behind it, just out of focus, was a shadow. The woman, her dark, hollow eyes locked onto mine, and the blood tears began to fall again, dripping soundlessly down the glass. Nope, I whispered, backing away. But before I could move too far, the glass cracked with a loud snap. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the crack spiderwebbed outward. For a moment, it stopped, the cracks frozen in place. Then, with a sound like shattering ice, the window exploded outward, shards raining onto the counter. She stepped through. This time, I didn't wait. I turned and bolted, nearly tripping over the corner of the counter in my rush to get away. Behind me, I heard her laugh, a raspy, broken sound that sent chills down my spine. I tore through the house, my bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. Every step felt slower than it should have, like the air itself was trying to hold me back. I threw a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. She was following Me, her movements unnatural and jerky, like a puppet on strings. Her clawed hands dragged against the walls, leaving deep gouges as she moved. The blood tears smeared across her cheeks and dripped onto the floor. But her grin never wavered. I rounded the corner in the living room, nearly skidding into the coffee table. My hands fumbled for something, anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a decorative lamp, and I yanked it off the table, the cord snapping as I swung it toward her. The base of the lamp connected with her shoulder, and she staggered, letting out a guttural hiss. But it wasn't enough to stop her. She straightened, her neck cracking unnaturally, and lunged at me again. I didn't think. I just ran, heading for the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, the adrenaline making my hands clumsy. Just as I managed to twist it open, I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck. A shiver shot down my spine, and I threw the door open, stumbling onto the porch. The sunlight hit me like a slap, harsh and blinding, but I didn't stop moving. I sprinted across the lawn, not caring that I was still barefoot and wearing pajamas. My only goal was to get as far away from the house as possible. When I reached the street, I dared to look back. The house stood silent and still, the front door swinging gently in the breeze. She was gone, or at least I couldn't see her anymore. But the reflection in the car window across the street told a different story. She was there, staring at me through the glass, her grin wide and unrelenting. I backed away, shaking my head. No, this isn't real. You're not real. The reflection tilted its head, mocking me. I turned and ran again, heading for the park at the end of the street. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. The open space of our park felt safer, less confined. There were no mirrors here, no glass for her to slip through, or so I thought. I collapsed onto a bench, gasping for air. For a moment, everything was quiet. Birds chirped in the trees, and the distant hum of traffic reminded me that the world was still normal, at least for everyone else. I tried to convince myself that I was safe. But then, I saw her. She was standing in the reflection of the pond, her silhouette rippling in the water. Her eyes were darker now, her grin wider, and the blood tears fell faster, staining the surface of the water with streaks of red. I jumped to my feet, backing away from the pond. She didn't move, but her reflection seemed to grow larger, her arms stretching toward me as if reaching through the water. "I'm not doing this," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "I'm not playing your game." Her laughter echoed around me, bouncing off the trees and blending with the rustling leaves. It was everywhere, surrounding me, pressing in on all sides. I turned and ran again, this time heading back toward the street. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay here. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. She wasn't just in the mirror anymore. She was everywhere. Every reflective surface was a potential doorway for her. When I finally stopped running, I was in front of an old hardware store. The display window was covered in dust, but I could still make out the faint shapes of tools and supplies inside. More importantly, I could see the faint outline of my reflection and hers, standing just behind me. "No more," I muttered, grabbing a brick from the ground. Without hesitation, I hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, raining down onto the sidewalk. Her reflection disappeared with it. For the first time all day, I felt a sliver of control. She needed the mirrors, the glass, and the reflections to shine through. Without them, she was powerless. At least, that's what I hoped. I picked up another brick and turned back toward the street. The windows of parked cars glinted in the sunlight, their surfaces mocking me. One by one, I started smashing them, ignoring the startled looks of passers-by. I didn't care about the damage or the noise. All that mattered was keeping her out. When I finally stopped, my hands were shaking, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The street was littered with shards of glass, the windows of the cars reduced to jagged frames. The woman was nowhere to be seen, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Back home, I barricaded the front door with a chair, a heavy cabinet, and every ounce of my dwindling courage. The house felt different now, colder, darker, and heavier, like the air itself was working against me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent chills down my spine. But for the first time in hours, I had a moment to think. I needed answers. Whoever, or whatever, the woman was, she had to be connected to the mirror. That much was obvious. But why? Why my house? My mirrors? And why me? Determined, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the attic. The attic was a dusty, forgotten space, filled with boxes of old clothes, yellowed newspapers, and broken furniture. It was the kind of place you avoided unless you absolutely had to be there. But my gut told me this was where I'd find what I was looking for. I rummaged through the boxes, my hands brushing against cobwebs and brittle paper. The dim beam of the flashlight barely pierced the darkness. But then it landed on something unusual, a small wooden chest tucked into the farthest corner of the room. It was locked, but the hinges were old and brittle. A quick jab with a screwdriver from the nearby toolbox, and the lock gave way. Inside, I found a collection of odd items, a cracked hand mirror, a bundle of dried lavender, and a faded photograph of a woman. My blood ran cold. It was her. The photograph was black and white, creased and yellowed with age. She looked younger, but unmistakable. The same hollow eyes, the same sharp features. The only difference was the absence of blood tears and the ghost of a smile on her lips. On the back of the photo, a name was scrawled in faded ink. Margaret Hall, 1923. Margaret Hall. The name rang no bells, but it felt heavy, significant. Beneath the photo, there was a slip of paper, folded and brittle. I opened it carefully, revealing a letter written in the same delicate handwriting. The letter was brief, but chilling. To whoever finds this, if you are reading this, the mirror has found a new home. I tried to destroy it, but it always returns. It is cursed, tied to Margaret Hall's spirit and her tragic end. She was wronged, driven to despair, and her rage lingers in the glass. Her presence will grow stronger, more dangerous, until she consumes you. There is no escaping her. If you cannot break the mirror, then you must confront her. Only the truth can set you free. The letter ended without a signature. My hands trembled as I folded it back up, my mind racing. Margaret Hall. The mirror. A curse. It sounded like something out of a terrifying horror movie, but it was all too real. I spent the next few hours digging through the chest and its contents, piecing together bits of Margaret's story. She had lived in this house nearly a century ago, long before my family had bought it. The mirror had belonged to her, a wedding gift from her husband, if the notes I found were to be believed. But her life had been far from happy. Her husband, it seemed, had been cruel, isolating her and driving her to the brink of madness. The few newspaper clippings I found suggested she had died tragically, though the details were murky. An accident, one paper said. Suicide claimed, another. The only thing they agreed on was that it had been violent. Her spirit had been tied to the mirror ever since, trapped in her pain and fury, lashing out at anyone who came near it. And now, she was lashing out at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than just unfortunate luck. The way she had looked at me, the way she had spoken, it wasn't random. There was a connection, a reason she had targeted me. But what? I dug deeper into the chest, searching for anything that might explain it. That's when I found the last item, an old property deed, folded neatly at the bottom. It listed the owners of the house over the decades, including my grandparents, who had bought it after Margaret's death. And then I saw it, my grandmother's maiden name, Margaret Hall. My stomach dropped. Margaret wasn't just some stranger who had lived here once. She was family. My great-grandmother, if the timeline was correct, and the mirror wasn't just a cursed object. It was part of my inheritance, passed down through the generations like a sinister heirloom. The realization hit me like a freight train. Margaret wasn't just haunting me out of rage. She was haunting me because I was her blood, her anger, her pain, her curse. It was mine now, too. Before I could process what I'd just learned, the flashlight flickered. The attic seemed to darken, the air growing heavier. My pulse quickened as I turned toward the small attic window. She was there, her face pressed against the glass, distorted and bloody, her hollow eyes burning with rage. The window cracked under the pressure, the sound sharp and deafening in the confined space. "Why did you come here?" Her voice rasped, echoing unnaturally in the attic. I stumbled back, the photograph and letter slipping from my hands. My heart raced as the window shattered, glass raining down onto the wooden floor. The air grew colder, and I felt her presence closing in. Grabbing the flashlight, I bolted down the attic stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I leaned against the door, my mind spinning. Margaret Hall wasn't just haunting the house. She was haunting me. Back home, I barricaded the front door with a chair, a heavy cabinet, and every ounce of my dwindling courage. The house felt different now, colder, darker, and heavier, like the air itself was working against me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent chills down my spine. But for the first time in hours, I had a moment to think. I needed answers. Whoever, or whatever, the woman was, she had to be connected to the mirror. That much was obvious. But why? Why my house? My mirrors? And why me? Determined, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the attic. The attic was a dusty, forgotten space, filled with boxes of old clothes, yellowed newspapers, and broken furniture. It was the kind of place you avoided unless you absolutely had to be there. But my gut told me this was where I'd find what I was looking for. I rummaged through the boxes, my hands brushing against cobwebs and brittle paper. The dim beam of the flashlight barely pierced the darkness, but then it landed on something unusual. A small, wooden chest tucked into the farthest corner of the room. It was locked, but the hinges were old and brittle. A quick jab with a screwdriver from the nearby toolbox, and the lock gave way. Inside, I found a collection of odd items: a cracked hand mirror, a bundle of dried lavender, and a faded photograph of a woman. My blood ran cold. It was her. The photograph was black and white, creased and yellowed with age. She looked younger, but unmistakable. The same hollow eyes, the same sharp features. The only difference was the absence of blood tears and the ghost of a smile on her lips. On the back of the photo, a name was scrawled in faded ink: Margaret Hall, 1923. Margaret Hall. The name rang no bells, but it felt heavy, significant. Beneath the photo, there was a slip of paper, folded and brittle. I opened it carefully, revealing a letter written in the same delicate handwriting. The letter was brief, but chilling. To whoever finds this, if you are reading this, the mirror has found a new home. I tried to destroy it, but it always returns. It is cursed, tied to Margaret Hall's spirit and her tragic end. She was wronged, driven to despair, and her rage lingers in the glass. Her presence will grow stronger, more dangerous, until she consumes you. There is no escaping her. If you cannot break the mirror, then you must confront her. Only the truth can set you free. The letter ended without a signature. My hands trembled as I folded it back up, my mind racing. Margaret Hall. The mirror. A curse. It sounded like something out of a terrifying horror movie, but it was all too real. I spent the next few hours digging through the chest and its contents, piecing together bits of Margaret's story. She had lived in this house nearly a century ago, long before my family had bought it. The mirror had belonged to her, a wedding gift from her husband, if the notes I found were to be believed. But her life had been far from happy. Her husband, it seemed, had been cruel, isolating her and driving her to the brink of madness. The few newspaper clippings I found suggested she had died tragically, though the details were murky. An accident, one paper said. Suicide claimed another. The only thing they agreed on was that it had been violent. Her spirit had been tied to the East mirror ever since, trapped in her pain and fury, lashing out at anyone who came near it. And now, she was lashing out at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than just unfortunate luck. The way she had looked at me, the way she had spoken, it wasn't random. There was a connection, a reason she had targeted me. But what? I dug deeper into the chest, searching for anything that might explain it. That's when I found the last item, an old property deed, folded neatly at the bottom. It listed the owners of the house over the decades, including my grandparents, who had bought it after Margaret's death. And then I saw it, my grandmother's maiden name, Margaret Hall. My stomach dropped. Margaret wasn't just some stranger who had lived here once. She was family, my great-grandmother, if the timeline was correct. And the mirror wasn't just a cursed object, it was part of my inheritance, passed down through the generations. like a sinister heirloom. The realization hit me like a freight train. Margaret wasn't just haunting me out of rage. She was haunting me because I was her blood, her anger, her pain, her curse. It was mine now, too. Before I could process what I'd just learned, the flashlight flickered. The attic seemed to darken, the air growing heavier. My pulse quickened as I turned toward the small attic window. She was there, her face pressed against the glass, distorted and bloody, her hollow eyes burning with rage. The window cracked under the pressure, the sound sharp and deafening in the confined space. Why did you come here? Her voice rasped, echoing unnaturally in the attic. I stumbled back, the photograph and letter slipping from my hands. My heart raced as the window shattered, glass raining down onto the wooden floor. The air grew colder, and I felt her presence closing in. Grabbing the flashlight, I bolted down the attic stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I leaned against the door, my mind spinning. Margaret Hall wasn't just haunting the house. She was haunting me. Margaret Hall wasn't just a name in a dusty letter anymore. She was real, and she was coming for me. My connection to her wasn't some coincidence. It was written in blood. But if she thought I'd sit back and wait for her to destroy me, she was dead wrong. This time, I wasn't going to run. I was going to fight back. I started with the basics. I boarded up every mirror I could find, hammering nails into wooden planks with hands that shook from adrenaline. Bathroom mirrors, decorative mirrors, even the old vanity tucked away in the guest room. They all had to go. Every reflective surface in the house became my enemy. But I knew it wasn't enough. Margaret had already shown that she could move beyond mirrors. She had emerged from glass and water, even the faint reflection of a window. I needed to take things a step further. I grabbed the cracked hand mirror from the attic, the one I'd found in the chest. If this was the source of her power, I wasn't just going to hide it, I was going to destroy it. In the backyard, I set the mirror on a makeshift altar of bricks. The evening air was cool, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the grass. I held a hammer in my hand, the weight of it solid and reassuring. "This ends now," I muttered, raising the hammer. The first swing hit the mirror dead center, shattering it into jagged pieces. The shards sparkled in the fading sunlight, scattering across the ground. I expected relief, a sense of victory. But instead, the air grew colder, and the wind picked up, swirling leaves and dust around me. The pieces of glass began to move, stumbled back as the shards lifted into the air, spinning faster and faster, like a miniature tornado. In the center of the storm, her face appeared, more twisted and angry than ever. "You cannot break me," she hissed, her voice cutting through the wind. "I am bound to you." The shards shot outward like knives, one slicing past my cheek. I ducked, covering my head as they embedded themselves in the trees, the fence, and the ground. When I looked up, she was gone, but her laughter lingered in the air. Back inside, I slumped against the wall, clutching the side of my face where the glass had nicked me. A thin line of blood trickled down my cheek, warm and sticky. Destroying the mirror hadn't worked. If anything, it had only made her stronger. I needed a new plan, My mind raced as I pieced together everything I knew about Margaret. She wasn't just angry, she was vengeful. Her spirit wasn't tied to the mirror by accident. It was bound by the pain and betrayal she'd experienced in life. If I couldn't destroy her directly, maybe I could weaken her by confronting that pain. But how? The attic had given me the clues. But I needed more. I needed something personal, something that would force her to face the truth of her own story. I decided to set a trap. If Margaret wanted me so badly, I'd give her what she wanted, on my terms. I cleared the living room, pushing furniture against the walls to create an open space. Then, I retrieved the broken hand mirror and placed it in the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of salt. I wasn't sure if the salt would actually work, but it was worth a shot. Finally, I lit a row of candles around the circle, their flames flickering in the dim light. The setup felt like something out of a horror movie, but I didn't care. All that mattered was drawing her out and forcing her to face me. I stood outside the circle, holding the photograph of Margaret in one hand and the letter in the other. "Margaret Hall," I called, my voice steady despite the fear bubbling in my chest. "I know who you are. I know what happened to you." The air grew colder, the shadows deepening. The flames of the candles flickered, nearly going out. Then, slowly, she appeared in the mirror. Her reflection was distorted, her face twisting with anger and pain. The blood tears fell faster now, staining the surface of the mirror. She stepped closer, her movements jerky and unnatural, until her face filled the glass. "You cannot escape me," she hissed. "You brought this upon yourself." "I didn't do anything to you," I said, holding up the photograph. "But I know what happened. I know the pain you went through." Her expression faltered for a moment, her hollow eyes narrowing. "You know nothing." "I know enough," I pressed. "You were wronged, hurt. But this isn't the way to fix it. You're hurting people who had nothing to do with what happened to you." The candles flickered wildly, the flames shooting upward. Her voice grew louder, angrier. "They took everything from me. My life is my happiness. Why should you be spared?" "Because I can help you," I said, stepping closer to the circle. "But you have to let go. You have to move on." She let out a scream that shook the walls, her figure stretching and warping as she stepped through the mirror. The salt circle held for a moment, the air crackling with energy. But then she broke through, scattering the salt across the floor. I grabbed the nearest candle and hurled it at her. The flame sputtered out as it hit her, but she recoiled, her form flickering like a dangerous signal. Taking advantage of her hesitation, I lunged for the hand mirror, holding it up like a shield. Her claws raked the air, inches from my face. "You cannot stop me," she shrieked. "I don't have to stop you," I said through gritted teeth. "You have to stop yourself." With one final effort, I shoved the mirror into her chest. Her body convulsed, a guttural scream tearing from her throat as the glass embedded itself into her form. The room filled with blinding light, and I was thrown backward, hitting the wall with a dull thud. When the light faded, she was gone. The room was silent again, save for the crackling of the remaining candles. I crawled to my feet, my entire body aching. The mirror lay shattered on the floor, its pieces dark and lifeless. It wasn't over. I could feel it, Margaret was still out there, waiting. But for now, I had won. For now, I could breathe. The house was still, eerily quiet after the chaos of the confrontation. My body ached, and every breath felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. Margaret was gone, for now, but I knew she wasn't finished with me. If I wanted any chance of survival, I needed to understand her, truly understand her. The answers were in the attic. They had to be, armed with a flashlight and the resolve to end this once and for all. I climbed the creaking stairs back to the attic. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. Shadows stretched across the walls. But this time, I didn't flinch. I couldn't afford to. The chest was still there, its contents scattered from my frantic search earlier. I sifted through the papers again, my hands trembling as I pieced together Margaret's life. The faded photographs, the brittle letters, they all painted a picture of a woman trapped in a life she couldn't escape. Margaret Hall was born in 1895, the only daughter of a wealthy family. Her beauty and charm made her a sought-after bride, and at the age of 21, she married a man named Victor Hall, a prominent businessman. From the outside, their life seemed perfect. An elegant home, lavish parties, and all the trappings of wealth. But behind closed doors, Margaret's life was anything but perfect. Victor was cruel, controlling, and quick to anger. He isolated Margaret from her friends and family, turning their home into a gilded cage. The letters she had written to a childhood friend, letters never sent, revealed the depth of her despair. I feel like a ghost in my own home. One letter read, Victor watches me constantly, even when I am alone. The mirrors, oh, the mirrors, are his eyes. I cannot escape them. Another letter hinted at a more sinister truth. I hear whispers at night, faint and cruel. He says I am imagining things, but I know better. Something is wrong with that mirror. Margaret's life unraveled completely after the birth of her first child. The baby, a boy named Henry, died of unknown causes at just 3 months old. Victor blamed Margaret, accusing her of negligence and refusing to let her leave the house. Her grief turned to madness, and the whispers in the mirrors grew louder. The final letter I found was unfinished, the ink smudged, as if her hand had trembled while writing it. I cannot take this anymore. I see her, the woman in the mirror. She cries blood and smiles, as if she knows my pain. She tells me it will end soon, that I will be free, but I am afraid of what freedom means, afraid of what she will do if I let her out. The date on the letter was the same day Margaret was found dead. According to the newspaper clippings, Margaret's death was ruled a suicide. She had been found in the bedroom, her wrists slit, and her body slumped against the vanity mirror. Blood had pooled around her, staining the rug and the mirror's ornate frame. But one detail stood out, repeated in every article I read. The mirror was completely intact, despite the violence of the scene. No one questioned it at the time, chalking it up to coincidence. But now, with everything I knew, it was clear. Margaret's spirit hadn't passed on. It had been trapped, bound to the mirror by her pain and anger. And the woman she had seen in the glass, the one who cried blood, wasn't someone else. It was her. The more I read, the more I understood why Margaret had come for me. Her pain wasn't just tied to the mirror. It was tied to the house, to the family that had abandoned her. She wasn't haunting me because I was a stranger. She was haunting me because I was one of them. Her blood ran in my veins, and she blamed me for the life stolen from her. But there was something else, something deeper. Her rage wasn't blind, it was purposeful. She wanted me to know what had happened to her. She wanted me to feel her pain and understand her suffering. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted me to set her free. At the bottom of the chest, hidden beneath a layer of crumbling newspaper, I found something I hadn't noticed before. A key. It was small and ornate, with the initials MH etched into the metal. My pulse quickened as I turned it over in my hands. What did it open? Another door? Another chest? As I searched the attic, my eyes landed on an old armoire pushed against the far wall. It was tall and imposing, its wood darkened with age. The keyhole was small and hidden beneath a layer of grime, but it was a perfect match. The lock clicked open, and the door creaked as I pulled it wide. Inside, I found a single object, a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. The pages were filled with Margaret's handwriting, recounting her final days in haunting detail. Her words were frantic, desperate, and filled with regret. Margaret wrote about the mirror obsessively, describing how it seemed to watch her, whisper to her, and draw her in. She believed it was a portal, a gateway to another place where her pain could live forever. But the more she wrote, the more her words became fragmented, her thoughts unraveling as the mirror consumed her. I see her everywhere now, one entry read, not just in the mirror, but in the windows, the water, and even the shine of my silver brush. She is me, and I am her. We are bound together in suffering. The final entry was the most chilling of all. Tonight, I will end this. I will give myself to the mirror, and she will take my place. But I fear what she will do when she is free. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. Margaret hadn't just died that night. She had sacrificed herself, hoping to end her suffering and protect her child's legacy. But something had gone wrong. Instead of freeing herself, she had unleashed the very thing she feared most: her pain, her rage, her reflection. And now, it was up to me to end it. The journal felt heavier in my hands than its small size should allow. Margaret's words, her pain, her fear, they clung to me, digging into my thoughts like splinters. She hadn't been just a victim of circumstance or cruelty. She had become the monster she feared most, and now that monster had me in her sights. I didn't have much time. Margaret wasn't going to wait for me to make the first move. If I wanted to survive and set her free, I had to destroy the mirror once and for all. But this time, I needed more than a hammer or salt. I needed to face her head on. I went back to the chest in the attic, gathering anything I thought might help. The lavender bundle seemed out of place, but I remembered reading in the journal that Margaret used it to silence whispers. I grabbed the cracked hand mirror and tucked it into my bag, hoping it might work as a lure. Lastly, I brought the journal itself. If Margaret still had a shred of humanity left, maybe her own words could reach her. The living room became my battlefield. I cleared the space once again, drawing a larger circle of salt in the center and surrounding it with candles. This time, I placed the shattered hand mirror in the middle, its shards reflecting the flickering light. My heart pounded as I lit the final candle, the flames casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. "Margaret Hall," I called, my voice firm, despite the tremor in my chest. "It's time to end this." The air grew heavy, pressing down on my shoulders like an invisible weight. The flames of the candles sputtered, their light dimming. A cold wind swept through the room, though every door and window was locked. And then she appeared. At first, it was just her reflection in the broken hand mirror, distorted and fragmented. Her eyes, black and hollow, locked onto mine as blood. Tears streaked her face. Slowly, she began to rise, stepping out of the shards like a wraith. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, as though she was fighting against unseen chains. "You cannot destroy me," she hissed, her voice echoing in the room. "I am bound to you, to this house, to this blood." Her form solidified, her claws glinting in the candlelight. The jagged edges of her grin widened as she stepped toward me, her bare feet leaving crimson stains on the floor. "Maybe I can't destroy you," I said, backing away. "But I can stop you." With a flick of my wrist, I tossed the lavender bundle into the salt circle. Margaret recoiled, her form flickering like a negative signal. She let out a guttural scream, clawing at the air as the lavender began to smolder, releasing a pungent, earthy scent. Her rage only grew. She lunged at the circle, but the salt held, sparks flying as her claws scraped against the invisible barrier. I grabbed the cracked hand mirror from my bag, holding it up like a shield. "You trapped yourself in this," I said, my voice shaking. "This mirror is your prison, but it's also the key to setting you free." Her form flickered again, the blood tears falling faster. For a moment, her expression shifted, pain and desperation cutting through the anger. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that same predatory grin. "You know nothing of my suffering," she spat, circling the cell like a caged animal. "You cannot comprehend the depths of my rage. The salt circle wouldn't hold forever." Margaret's claws raked at it, scattering grains across the floor. The flames of the candles grew wild, their light casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls. I had to act fast. I pulled out the journal, holding it up so she could see her own handwriting. "You wrote this," I said. "You were afraid of what you'd become. You didn't want this. You wanted peace." Her movements stilled, her hollow eyes narrowing as she stared at the journal. "Lies," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not a lie," I shouted. "You hated what Victor did to you. You hated what this mirror turned you into. But you're not him. You're not what he made you." For a moment, the room fell silent. Her form flickered again, her claws retracting slightly. But then her face twisted in rage, and she screamed, a sound that shattered the remaining candles and sent shards of glass flying from the mirror. The salt circle broke. The room around me warped and twisted, the walls bending like reflections in funhouse mirrors. I staggered, disoriented, as Margaret's laughter echoed all around me. Every surface became reflective, and in each one, I saw her, laughing, crying, clawing at the glass. "This is my world now," she said, her voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You cannot escape." I clutched the hand mirror tightly, its surface cracked, but still intact. "I'm not trying to escape," I muttered. "I'm ending this." I ran, dodging her clawed hands as they reached out from every reflection. The maze of mirrors seemed endless, but I kept moving, following the faint light of the journal's pages as they glowed faintly in my hand. At the center of the maze, I found the original mirror, the ornate frame intact, its surface rippling like liquid. Margaret's full form emerged from it, towering and monstrous, her eyes burning with fury. "You will join me," she snarled, her claws raised. "No," I said, stepping forward. "You will join yourself." With all the strength I could muster, I hurled the hand mirror onto the liquid surface of the larger mirror. The two mirrors collided, their shards merging in a blinding explosion of light and sound. Margaret let out a scream that shook the ground, her form fracturing and twisting as the mirror pulled her back inside. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine one last time, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw gratitude. Then she was gone. The ornate mirror cracked from the center outward, splintering into 1,000 tiny shards. Each piece reflected a fragment of Margaret's face before falling to the ground in silence. The air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting as the house returned to normal. I dropped to my knees, the journal slipping from my grasp. It was over. The mirror was destroyed, and Margaret was finally free. Or so I hoped. The house was quiet now, almost unnervingly so. The oppressive weight that had clung to every corner was gone, replaced by a fragile stillness. But the damage was undeniable. Shattered glass littered the floor, deep gouges marred the walls, and the faint scent of smoke from the extinguished candles lingered in the air. I sat in the center of the living room, staring at the remnants of the mirror. Tiny shards glinted in the morning light, filtering through the windows, each one reflecting a fragment of my exhausted face. My body ached, my hands were cut and bruised, but I was alive, and Margaret was gone. I dragged myself to my feet, wincing as pain shot through my legs. The journal lay on the coffee table, its leather cover scorched, but intact. I flipped through the pages one last time, searching for something. Closure, maybe, but found only the same desperate words. Margaret's pain had been real, her rage justified, but it had consumed her. She'd become a monster, bound by her own suffering, destroying. The mirror had freed her, but at what cost? My house was a wreck, my life in shambles, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been changed too. The thought lingered as I swept up the shards of glass, careful not to look too closely at the reflections. The last thing I needed was to see her face again. Over the next few days, I worked to put the house back together. I patched the walls, replaced the broken furniture, and got rid of every single mirror. The bathroom was the hardest. The memory of her emerging from the cracked glass still haunted me, but even there, I scrubbed and cleaned until it was unrecognizable. Neighbors stopped by, curious about the noises they'd heard and the shattered windows they'd seen. I brushed them off with vague excuses about a freak accident, grateful they didn't press for details. How could I explain what had really happened? For a while, things seemed to return to normal. The house was quiet, the air no longer heavy with Margaret's presence. But the scars remained, both on the walls and in my mind. Avoided reflective surfaces as much as I could, but it wasn't always possible. One evening, as I passed by the stainless steel fridge, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, faint and fleeting, gone before I could turn my head. It was probably nothing, just my nerves playing tricks on me, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. A week after the final confrontation, I found something strange. While sorting through the attic, I discovered a single shard of the original mirror tucked beneath the chest. It was small, barely the size of my palm, but its surface was smooth and unbroken. At first, I considered smashing it, but something stopped me. Instead, I wrapped it in cloth and placed it in a box, locking it away in the very chest where I'd first uncovered Margaret's story. Maybe it was foolish, but part of me couldn't let it go. It felt like a reminder, a piece of her that still lingered, silent but watching. Life didn't go back to normal. Not completely. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen or unfeel the terror that had gripped me. But I learned to live with it. The house became less of a battleground and more of a home again. Though its history was never far from my mind, I kept the journal on my nightstand, a constant reminder of what had happened and what I'd survived. Sometimes I'd read a passage or two, not to relive the fear, but to honor Margaret's memory. She had been a victim, too, and in a way, I had given her the peace she couldn't find in life. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, the faintest sound of glass cracking. My heart raced as I sat up, scanning the room. The shadows seemed darker, heavier, but nothing moved. I told myself it was just the house settling, the product of an overactive imagination. But as I turned off the light and lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that somewhere in the darkness, Margaret, or something else, was still watching. The last thought I had before sleep took me was simple, but chilling. Mirrors can break, but reflections never truly disappear.